Welcome, everyone. Dr. Adam here. Today's lecture is on honey plants and forage habitat. Well, when it comes to understanding how bees allocate resources and how to provide resources for those organisms, it's really important to understand the fundamentals of habitat management, and what we are experiencing globally as far as habitat loss. So, when we think about habitat in the context of any living organism, what we're talking about is the physical environment where an organism lives. And this is the environment that provides the necessities of life. So, good environmental conditions, water, food, shelter, the fundamentals to life for pretty much any organism on the planet, right? So, every organism has found these niches within the environment where these particular necessities of life exist for their particular needs. And every organism is going to have a different requirement as far as habitat is concerned. But these niches that we find within nature is where evolution takes place, and why why all organisms are so well suited to the habitat for which they are adapted. Now, in the United States and globally, we've experienced a tremendous amount of habitat loss. Native habitat loss is what we're talking about here. Now, habitat can be something that you participate in, but it's also the natural environment as well. And so when we're talking about habitat loss in the context of pollinators, what we're particularly talking about is the loss of floral habitats that provide floral resources for pollinators. And that's really important to understand, because when we talk about that in the context of modern agriculture, we see landscapes like this. So we've really gone away from the diversified landscapes that you see in this image here, which is just a field of all sorts of native flowers, to something like this, which are managed habitats. And in this case, you have a lot of managed crops that really aren't even suitable for pollinators. So things like corn, for example. Corn is a wind-pollinated plant. It doesn't rely on pollinators to provide pollination. And so, because it's a wind-pollinated plant, it has not evolved to provide nectaries, which are where food in the form of nectar is provided to organisms like bees. And so, if you have a landscape that is primarily corn, and you're trying to put honeybees in that landscape is akin to a moonscape for them. Now, they'll go and collect pollen from corn when they have to, but it's a low quality pollen for bees, and there's no nectar reward. So when we see these huge agricultural landscapes, particularly in the Midwest, where you see just cornfield after cornfield after cornfield, those are really poor habitats for pollinators, and really, explicitly show you the impact of habitat loss, because in those areas, it's very, very difficult to raise organisms like honeybees. And native bee populations have been decimated because of things like habitat loss and the green revolution that happened after World War II, and the big advent of monoculture agriculture. And that's one of the main issues within habitat loss as a principle, is this idea that we've lost quality forage for so many organisms through commercial agriculture and through monoculture agriculture, that we've created essentially areas where these organisms can no longer survive, which were part of their native range originally. One of the things, and I'll get off my soapbox here in a moment, but one of the things that I as an individual have always been advocating for, and something that we practice here at Bee Wise Farms, is small scale diversified agriculture. My personal belief is that our success as humans, our ability to move forward, relies on the return to small-scale production of agricultural commodities in diversified landscapes, because folks that are small farmers tend to not rely on one single crop, but rather on many, many crops. And oftentimes those farmers are incorporating things like cover crops and things like that that help improve habitat over time. So habitat loss is a really big problem. If you live in an area that is highly, highly monoculture agriculture, that is what we're talking about, is just complete loss of diversified natural. And habitat doesn't have to be just native habitat. Habitat can be introduced plants as well, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment. Now, as far as what can you do, right, about habitat loss? Well, we can participate in something that is called habitat management. So what is habitat management? Habitat management is the manipulation of habitat to make it more suitable for a species of or group of species. So a specific organism you're trying to work with, or a group of organisms that oftentimes rely on the same sort of resources. Pollinators are a great example because your pollinators rely on two major resources. Well, in the form of food, nectar and pollen. And so if you are trying to support pollinators by creating habitat or managing habitat, you're working with a group of organisms, not a specific one. But oftentimes, especially in conservation programs where we're trying to help an organism that is declining, kind of reboot, monarch butterflies are a prime example. They are reliant on milkweed. And so milkweed plantings have been something that has been a big part of conservation to help the population of monarchs with a specific target on a specific species, not a group of species like pollinators in general. But what we do within habitat management is we can help these organisms by manipulating things like the type and quality of food. So providing quality forage for organisms that we're trying to work with. We can provide a different amount of food. So we can add more food to the landscape. And going back to something like monarchs, oftentimes we see milkweed on roadsides, and we could take seed from milkweed, create fields of it, and you're providing a much larger amount of food in that for that particular species. You can also manipulate the arrangement of food. So we have a rule on our farm that a quarter of all of our land, and right now it's actually way more than that, it's probably 60% of our land, stays in native habitat. And then the areas that we have production in, a quarter of those areas are dedicated specifically to pollinator habitat. So we have pollinator strips throughout our land that allow us to basically arrange food in different areas for our pollinators. Water is something also that is necessary for most organisms on our planet, right? So you have to have water present within these landscapes if you're trying to help with habitat. Oftentimes, we lose water when we are going into production fields, because many times production fields are drained because of standing water. And so if you have a field that's on drain tiles or something like that, that water is being moved off site, essentially, or into and really sometimes in areas that are not accessible for certain organisms. Now, it just depends on the organism you're working with. Keep in mind that bees can fly for 3 miles. So if there's a water source around, that's something they'll access. But also keep in mind, if the water source that's near you, maybe there's something, maybe it's been contaminated or something like that, you're going to want to augment that by providing freshwater resources somewhere else that you have control over. Cover is also something that organisms need, and oftentimes we provide in habitat management. Something as simple as a pile of debris sometimes can serve as shelter. Hibernaculums are a really good example of that, which are essentially just debris piles that you can create on your farm to help with vertebrates, to help provide shelter for vertebrates. Bee houses is another one. Bat houses is another example of providing cover or shelter for specific species of you're trying to support on your land. So something else that you can do with habitat management. When we get down to the nuts and bolts of all of this, when we're talking in the context of pollinators, and we're going to shift right to pollinators and specifically bees now, we're talking about nectar and pollen and the diversity of both. In order to provide good habitat for these particular organisms, you really, really need to have a diversity of high quality pollen and nectar. And let's talk about that just for a moment. When we're talking about nectar in the context of food resources, we're talking about carbohydrates. This is the energy that that bees acquire through feeding on these particular sources. Now, these are collected from nectaries on flowers, flowers that are co-evolved with pollinators. So flowers that require insect pollination, like this lavender plant you see right here. Those types of flowers have adapted and evolved to provide nectar rewards for insects that come to the flower. The reason that they've evolved these nectaries is because if you don't have a reward for an insect that's a pollinator, like a honeybee, the bees generally are not just going to come to you prolifically for a pollen reward. And so typically pollen is collected as an incidental. Pollen is not the thing that honeybees are going for when they hit flowers. They're generally going for the nectar, and then pollen is collected on the hairs as they interact with the flower. It literally sticks to them. And so that is essentially how these plants have evolved. And so you have plants with floral nectaries that are buried generally deep down in flowers, so that insects really have to work to get to them, which allows them to interact with the anthers of the plant, which is where your pollen grains are. So that is something to understand. Now, plants also have adapted other nectaries to provide pollen rewards for insects, and not only always related to bees. Ants are another another insect that does use does use nectaries of plants, and these are called extrafloral nectaries. These are actually nectaries that you'll see on stems, on leaf bottoms, all sorts of areas of plants that have adapted to work with certain insects. And bees will collect from extrafloral nectaries as well, but primarily they're working on floral nectaries in the flowers. Pollen. Pollen is the other food item that honeybees and pollinators are after. It's collected from the flower anthers, and as you can see in this diagram right here, you want to pay attention to where the anthers usually are located, which is usually at the top side of the sexual organs of the flower. But you see that those anthers are usually up front, and that means that when the insect comes to the flower, they're hitting the anthers first, which is where the pollen's at, and that's attaching to them. And then you see, in general, the nectaries are usually buried down in the flowers. And so pollinators have to work to get to those nectaries, and that's where the pollen interaction comes from. Now, when it comes to honeybees, pollen is, and pollinators in general, pollen is the protein source that they're collecting from plants, and is the major component or major food source that they need to raise young. So you need to feed protein to young for them to get to grow big and strong, right? So within honeybees, we have proteins that are really important to our bees. And some of the proteins that are super important are essential amino acids that are part of these protein complexes. Now, with honeybees, they require 10 essential amino acids, and they're getting these from pollen, and not all pollen has all of the essential amino acids that bees require. So some pollen sources are better than others, and we'll talk about a few of those here as we get into the plant side of this lecture. Pollen also contains starches, it contains fats, it contains a whole host of vitamins and minerals. Pollen is critical to bee development. Again, nectar is carbohydrates. You're just burning those to burn calories. Pollen is where the protein is that we raise bees from. And so that's why it's so important. So when we talk about this in general, what you really need to understand is that the flowers available to your bees are critical to their health. If you live in an area that does not have large amounts of flowers in the landscape, now trees have flowers and perennial plants have flowers, annual plants have flowers. So there's a diversity of things that bees can gather resources from. But when you're looking at your landscape, your area, the habitat that you're using for your bees, you need to understand that there are really, really important things out there in the landscape for these bees. And if you don't have them, it's going to be very hard for your bees to thrive. Like I said, if you live in a corn landscape, they'll feed on corn. They'll go collect pollen from it. It's a very low quality. And so in situations like that, habitat management is really important because you need to provide more resources for your bees because they don't exist in the landscape. So what I generally tell folks and kind of how to think about this, because this is kind of a daunting task. Like I'm telling you, you need to know what is flowering in your landscape so that you know if you have forage for your bees. Now, how do you do that? Well, one of the ways that you can do that real easily is take your first year of beekeeping and take pictures and write down an ID every single thing you see flowering in your area in that 3-mile radius. This doesn't have to be you trudging around in fields. You can basically take the roads and just see what's flowering in which month. And it'll give you a good idea of how much forage you have available and what forage you have available and when it blooms. Because one of the most important things about habitat management is what we are trying to do when we are incorporating new species of plants into a landscape is we're trying to create a situation where there are overlapping bloom times throughout the entire year. Well, entire beekeeping season for us in the UP in northern Michigan. So you want to make sure that as you're observing what's in your landscape, you notice when there's something not flowering as well, because you can fill that gap. We call those dearths, times of the year when there's really just not a lot in the landscape. You can oftentimes fill those dearths with other species of plants to provide a wholesome amount of food all season long. All right, so the next slides that we're going to go through, I'm going to introduce you to 13 plants today. And this is a really, really surface level introduction into honey plants. What I'm trying to do with introducing you to these plants is introduce you to the scope of plants available to your bees that they use as resources for pollen and nectar. Now, this is not a complete list, and I'll share with you a couple lists that other organizations have created that illustrate kind of the overlapping bloom time concept and different species of plants that you can use. But I want to instill upon you that habitat, when you're creating, when you're managing habitat and creating food sources for your bees, oftentimes these are not native plants. And I'm not going to be just talking about native plants. I'm going to be talking about several introduced plants as well. So always keep in mind that habitat and the concept of what we're thinking about for honeybees is not always going to be a native landscape because honeybees are not native to North America. So that is why oftentimes when we create pollinator mixes that are focused on honeybees, they have introduced species in them. So this is not a lecture on native plants. This is a lecture on honey plants appropriate for honeybees. And we'll even talk about some invasive species, and not in the context of good or bad, but that they exist and your bees like them, okay? So just get that through your head right now, that when we're talking about honeybees and resources for honeybees, thinking that this is going to be native plants is the wrong thought, because honeybees are introduced species into the United States. So let's jump in. Again, some of these are going to be native, some of them are not. But let's start with some of the natives. And what basically, before we get started here, I'm just going to kind of train your eyes to the slide. So what we have here is basically, I'm going to have descriptions here on the left. We'll have a picture of whatever flower it is I'm talking about on the right. And then this bar up top will shift as we go through species of plants to illustrate when the bloom times are for these plants. And the idea with these 13 plants that I selected is that you will see that they overlap over time. April through November is what we're talking about here in the context of beekeeping seasons in northern Michigan and the Upper Peninsula. Granted, April and November may be a little on the long side, but we have weird years. And so we'll talk about all of these months over the course of this lecture and what species are flowering during these time periods. So let's start at the beginning of the season for those of us in northern climates. Typically, the soft maples are some of the very first things that flower in our landscapes. And oftentimes they flower so early that many of our bees or our honeybees many times can't take advantage of them because the weather is still just not appropriate for good days of flying and foraging. So you will oftentimes see these flowering in stands of trees. If you're walking around in the woods kind of in the beginning of the spring before anything else is leafed out, you will see these red areas of maple trees. Just, you'll see just areas where there's these red blossoms that you see coming on. And the reason that you see those so early is because these maples, like red maple and silver maple, their flowers appear before their leaves do. So you'll always see that color pop in these kind of open landscapes, which is a really easy way to identify these trees, is because nothing else is flowering. All the rest of your trees are bare at this time. This is really the first thing that comes out that has color in those landscapes. It's a great early nectar and pollen source if the bees can take advantage of it because of the weather during that time, like I said. But that's one of the first things that comes out for us here in northern climates. Willows. Willows are kind of the next thing in the succession of trees that really comes on that time of the year. And there are lots of species of willows. They typically like wet habitats. They have these huge clusters of flowers that provide a ton of nectar and pollen for bees. And they're a little bit later than the maple. So typically the willows are one of the first trees that are consistently being used by bees at the early part of the season. And so this is a great tree to have in your landscape. They get very large, provide just tons of flowers, really, really nice opportunity to not only offer tree willows, but pussy willows, things like that. Lots of different species that are appropriate for honeybees. As we keep in May and June, dandelions start to come on. And dandelions are a classic spring plant. It's like that first flowering plant that you see in the grass coming up. And it is really a good plant for managed areas. So typically, because dandelion is able to grow so low to the ground, it can tolerate mowing. And so it makes a really good crop oftentimes to let come up in middles of rows. So it's hard to see in this picture, but this is actually one of our iris fields. And this is from our old farm in Lansing. And what you can see is that we let the dandelion just persist in between these rows. It's not super competitive with the crop that we're growing because it's a perennial crop. And so it allows these little flowers to pop up, and they're very numerous in landscapes that are typically mowed. And you don't get a lot of other great flowering stuff in mowed landscapes. And so that's what's really nice about this, is it's great in managed areas. It is really poor on pollen quality. So those 10 amino acids I told you that bees rely upon from pollen sources, this only provides 4 of the 10 amino acids. And so if bees cannot be reared on dandelion pollen alone, is what it comes down to. And there's been studies that have looked at this, and then bees just can't really raise young with this kind of deficit of amino acids. And so, but typically this is also occurring in diversified landscapes. It's not like you have just monocrops of dandelion most of the time. There's usually other stuff going on during this time, like the willows that we just talked about. So it's a plant that, most people, I know a lot of people used to, pull this out of their yards. I remember my mom, constantly pulling dandelions out of the lawn. And I believe that kind of the concepts or at least the thinking around that has changed quite a bit, because I see more and more people just letting dandelions go, which is great because it does help out bees, especially during that time of the season when there's just not a ton of stuff around. The next things that we see coming up, these are trees that we see in May and June, are early flowering fruit trees. So stone fruits are one of those, like peaches, plums, cherries, apricots. These require insect pollination. And the nice thing about some of these is that when you get good weather during this time of the year, this is also a group of crops that flowers May and June, which can be super dicey for us in the north. Sometimes you're going to get, a honey crop off of these. Sometimes you're not. It's all just going to depend on weather. But you can get specific blooms, and cherry blossom honey is an example of a varietal honey that you can pull if you're in an area with lots of cherries. I'd say like the Traverse City area, somewhere like that, where you have just acreage of cherries. You can actually get a really nice honey off of those during the early part of the season if the weather is appropriate. Same thing goes for the Rosaceae family. These are apples and pears. These require insect pollination as well, and you can get those specific honey crops. One of the first fields that we kept bees on in Michigan was an organic apple orchard, and it was a huge apple orchard. And we would oftentimes, about every other year, get a good apple blossom honey. Again, weather related. Oftentimes, when these are flowering, it's too cold or rainy for bees to really take advantage of them. You do have a lot of seasons where you do get good weather during this time, and that's when you're going to get those good flows of honey during those times. But if you're in a big area with apples or pears or peaches or cherries, and typically on the west coast of Michigan is where you're going to find a lot of this stuff, you can oftentimes get a really good honey crop out of these. Clovers. So clovers, many introduced species in the clovers family, and many of them, most of them are good to very good forage sources for bees. They're super easy to incorporate into a landscape, especially if they're small seeded plants. Oftentimes you can just incorporate them through broadcasting the seed. So you can buy big bags of sweet clover. We buy sweet clover every year, and we dump it just about in all of our fields that we're doing production in as a cover crop. So we let that come up after our crops have emerged, and you can see the flowers. This picture right here, the flowers are just the plants are just filled with numerous stalks of very small flowers. It's an excellent pollen source, excellent nectar source. Like I said, it's used extensively as a cover crop. Really great flowering time. It is persistent throughout almost the entire season. So you can see this really start, with the white Dutch clovers in your lawn. You can see that start as early as May, depending on the weather. And your sweet clovers oftentimes will persist through August. So really fantastic forage. On the roadsides in the Upper Peninsula, you see sweet clover a lot. It's everywhere in the Upper Peninsula. Some view it as somewhat of an invasive plant as well. It is all over the place, is the reality of it. So that is a great forage for your crop or for your plants. Or excuse me, for your bees, a great forage crop for your bees. Bird's foot trefoil. Bird's foot trefoil is an awesome forage for bees. And I've worked with a lot of commercial beekeepers over the years, and there's a commercial beekeeper I've worked with for many years down in the Lower Peninsula, and I remember taking rides with him kind of the first few times we had met and hung out, and he would drive me around all around to go see their out apiaries around his main operation. And I will never forget, we were in this food plot that was being created by the DNR for deer. And we were driving around in here, and he just kept pointing out all of this trefoil all over the roadsides, all in the fields. And he constantly came back to just how good of a source for forage trefoil is for bees. And so it always really stuck with me. And then when I moved to the Upper Peninsula, this stuff is everywhere. And the reason it's everywhere is because it was used as a forage for livestock on really poor soils for a long time. And so it persists. I have it all over in my lawn. It's all over the roadsides in the Upper Peninsula. This stuff is all over the place. If you have fields that are being hayed, this is typically in there as well. Now, the thing about bird's foot trefoil is that in some areas, it's actually considered an invasive. And in Minnesota, there's actually campaigns to help fight the invasive bird's foot trefoil. We don't have that in Michigan. So, it all just comes down to what conservationists are looking at as a target that is creating issues in their area. And, perhaps bird's foot trefoil is not creating issues in our areas, but it does reseed very heavily. It is a perennial. It is a great honey crop. So that is something that we see from June through about August, and really just a fantastic crop for your bees. Basswood, American basswood. When it comes to flowering trees that are going to just just load your colonies with nectar, basswood really is the one. If you have stands of basswood in your property, in your forage area, boy, that is like hitting a lottery. When we had an apiary in Lansing, just outside of MSU's campus, MSU has a field of this basswood that was planted in the 70s, and really has grown to be a beautiful area right next to the entomology field research center in East Lansing. Our forage area included that particular plot, and our bees would bring in basswood honey in the middle of this, in the big time of the honey flow for us, which down there was typically in late June when we would get basswood coming in down there. But up here in the northern Michigan and Upper Peninsula, typically this is early July, late June sometimes. But just these plants, when bees forage on these, not only does it create a really nice honey, and it has kind of like a minty flavor to it, and it's a very sought after by consumers. But the nectar just comes off in buckets. If you stand underneath one of these trees, and you can see how many flowers are on the tree that's in this picture. If you're standing under one of these trees, it's like it's raining nectar on warm days. I mean, it's ridiculous how much nectar is coming off of these trees. And standing under them, not only will you get showered with nectar, but the trees literally vibrate because they have so many pollinators on them. An excellent tree to have in your landscape. You can plant this. It's a native, fantastic tree. Milkweeds. So milkweeds we tend to see from July to September in the northern climate areas. Milkweeds, there's a lot of different milkweeds out there. They are great nectar sources, have lovely fragrance to a lot of them. Large flower clusters that they provide. The only issue with milkweed as a forage source for honeybees is that they do have these horseshoe-shaped pollen grains that you see in this picture right. Find my cursor right there. And you can see in this top picture that the way that the honeybee claws are, they're called tarsi, the way that the tarsi are, they oftentimes get hooked up on these milkweed pollen grains. And sometimes it's difficult for them to disconnect them from a plant. So you do see in this picture right here, you see that oftentimes bees will get stuck on milkweed. And you'll find dead bees on milkweed plants pretty often. It's not something that's like a huge problem. Like you're not going to lose all your colonies because they're all getting caught up on milkweed, but it does happen. It's something to keep in mind. But milkweed is a great pollinator plant. It has a great fragrance for most of the species and really looks beautiful in the landscape to begin with. And also, if you're trying to support monarch butterflies, that's the plant you want to be planting. Alfalfa. So alfalfa has a really fantastic ratio of flowers. There was research done in the 1940s, and this research sought to basically determine how many flowers are on flowering alfalfa fields per acre. And what they came up with in this study was that there are about 2 billion flowers per acre in alfalfa. That is like a smorgasbord for honeybees and all sorts of pollinating insects. The problem with alfalfa is the only way that you get those 2 billion flowers is if you let it go to seed. And most alfalfa is not produced for seed. It's produced for forage for livestock. And so it ends up that these crops oftentimes get harvested right before the bees can actually use it. So if you have acreage and you want to plant alfalfa, let me tell you, it's a great nectar source. You will produce a ton of honey off of that. But it's a poor pollen source. So you have the flip side of that. But, incorporating alfalfa into a landscape with other plants, again, it's providing a good forage source. And look at how long this can persist. You can get a second flush out of it if you do a cut. If you let it flower in July or into early August, give it a cut, and then let it come back. And by cut, I mean not a deep cut, not like not like a harvest cut. I'm talking more of like trying to encourage more growth. You can get another resprout in September. So it can be a really good source for bees. Knapweed, also known as star thistle. Boy, this is like the most controversial plant that there is in the beekeeping industry and the conservation industries. This is where conservationists and beekeepers really collide. And I've worked in both industries. I've done conservation work, worked on invasive species eradication campaigns with conservation districts out in California. I'm also a beekeeper and a farmer. And I understand what knapweed is as far as the impact it has on crops, on livestock, on native plant ranges. I understand all of that. And I'm not here to advocate for knapweed. It is an invasive species. It truly is an invasive species. It produces phytotoxins in the root zone that helps it outcompete native plants. So once it establishes in an area, it takes over. And you can pretty much drive anywhere in the state of Michigan and find fields of this stuff flowering in July and August. I was just in the Traverse City area, I guess it was probably 2 weeks ago, and literally acreage of this flowering in areas. Now, once it establishes, it's very difficult to get rid of. And even on my own farm, we pull it when it comes up, but it's everywhere. Up here in this eastern upper peninsula, this stuff is everywhere, especially in those fields that are not managed. Now, even though it's a super invasive plant, this is an excellent honey forage, and it produces a very sought after honey. The amount of nectar that comes off of star thistle is off the charts. And because it can grow in just about any environment, I mean, from poor soils to good soils, this plant can grow. It can provide some really valuable forage in areas where forage sometimes is just not available. This is a problem, though, for conservationists because they're trying to make sure that, you know, this does not take over landscapes. And it does. It takes over landscapes, and where you can't grow other things on the land that has been taken over by knapweed. But as a beekeeper, it is an excellent honey source. This is the dichotomous nature of beekeeping, is that sometimes the best things for your bees are not the best things for our environment. Mainly because you live in North America where honeybees are not native. So anyways, but a really great honey plant. You're going to interact with it no matter what. It's not, that's why I listed on here, is because no matter what, this is going to be part of your flowering resource profile in your area if you live in Michigan or most of the upper Midwest. All right, I've got a couple more plants for us, and we'll wrap it up. The last one one of the last ones I'm going to talk about, this is the last plant that you would plant. So this is something that you would put in the landscape, is buckwheat. Buckwheat is one of my favorite pollinator plants, especially for honeybees. It's a late season forage. It starts usually in July if it's planted early in the season, and it'll persist through frost, or until you hit your frost. And let me tell you, bees love it. It produces a really niche market honey. It's a dark color. It's molasses in flavor. If you've seen buckwheat honey, it usually commands a premium price, generally $25 a pound or more for buckwheat sourced honey. It also attracts a lot of beneficial insects. We use it as a flowering border strip. We intercrop it with other crops that we're growing. We put buckwheat a lot of places on our farm. In addition, it's a great forage for deer in the winter because the seeds are very nutritious that come off of them. But it's a fantastic plant. And one of my favorite types of buckwheat, it's what's pictured here. Buckwheat's typically white. This is pink buckwheat. This is Takane buckwheat from the Himalayas that we grow on our farm here. So there's different types of buckwheat you can grow as well. Goldenrod is our late season, kind of our final flower of the season. It is a really good forage source if the bees can take advantage of it, meaning that the weather is appropriate for it. Typically, we're seeing this in late August through September. It does produce a honey that's amber in color, and really what it's known for is it has a very kind of stinky smell to it, like kind of like gym socks. A lot of people don't like it because of that particular quality, but it is really the last big forage of the season that we have. So something to really keep your eyes on. And typically you're going to see it in big areas like you see in this picture, just kind of taking over on roadsides, open native fields, things like that. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with a couple resources that I really like specific to this subject. The MSU Bulletin E2973 is a list of 26 native plants and what their bloom times are. You can see that in this chart. You have that overlapping bloom time illustrated here that I'm talking about. It also gives you kind of a score on how good these are for bees and natural enemies, which are the predators and parasitic insects that attack your bad insects on your farm or in your landscape. So this is a really nice thing to look at as far as for thinking about plant selection of native plants. Another really good resource is the Xerxes Society. They have all sorts of plant lists for the entire United States, specific to pollinators and what they're good for. So another great resource to look at for any potential plants that you want to put in your landscape. All right, last thing I'm going to wrap it up with is things to consider about your apiary when you're thinking about habitat and flowering plants. We only talked about 13 flowering plants today, but there are a whole bunch more. Big thing you need to understand is you need to assess your forage in your landscape. So look at that 3-mile radius, start writing things down when you see them flowering or taking pictures of them, and just create a log of what you have seen in your landscape, even if it's just a digital picture log. You can Google Earth your areas to also get a good idea from an aerial standpoint of what's in production and what's not. So your native areas versus your production areas. You can develop a plot plan from this to help you identify what flowers you want to select to fill in those gaps that you have. So lay out a plot that's going to be on your land and fill it in with wonderful pollinator plants. Determining bloom times of the plants in your landscape is really important because it helps you ID the weaknesses in your forage resources. So if you know that you have times of the year where there's nothing available and bees are flying, it's probably a good indication of what plants to select to fill that gap. All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and we'll see you at the next one.